Good morning. My name's Jeff. All right. I'm excited to be able to share in the teaching of God's Word this morning. If you have in your Bibles, I'd invite you to turn to Joshua chapter 5. I'll bring us up to speed where we are in the series so far. If you were to consider it like something of a trilogy, it would be Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, and then Judges. It's something of a trilogy. Deuteronomy explains the covenant, the agreement that God has made with his people, that if they observe his laws, that he is also going to be faithful to them and maintain them and provide for them. And so that's the fabric of the relationship is in Deuteronomy. And then Joshua is where they go into the land under the banner of that covenant. And then Judges is what happens when they disobey the covenant. But here we are in Joshua, and what we've seen up to this point in the story. Do you remember? This is it. This is the moment that we've all been waiting for. Moses, God raised up a great champion, and he stood in the gap, and he bartered their release with Pharaoh. He brought them out of Egypt. He took the boot of the oppressor off their neck, freed them from slavery, and led them into the wilderness en route to the promised land. And this whole expedition was attended to by miraculous signs and wonders. God was with his people. And then they get up to the banks of the Jordan and they lose their nerve. You know the story. 40 years before the events of Joshua 3 and 4, that generation came up to the banks of the Jordan and they lost their nerve. They did not trust that God was with them. Despite the miraculous despite all the way God attended their exodus, they still doubted, and so they lost their nerve, and so they wandered for 40 years. And here they are again. Last week, we looked at it. Here they are, right up to the banks of the Jordan, flooded. It is at flood stage. Normally a creek, it's a quarter mile wide of churning white water and certain death. And God stops it up. He gives this generation their own miniature Red Sea miracle, just so they will remember who they followed or remember who they are. And now we get to chapter 4 is the rest of the crossing, and chapter 5, this is where we are today. This is it. They've made it across the Jordan. Here they are standing in the shadows of Jericho, the most ascendant military power, the most fortified city in the region. This is it. Okay, so Joshua chapter 5. I'm going to read the whole thing, 15 verses. Now, when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings among the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath, at Haraloth, and this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about in the wilderness 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land he had solemnly promised their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. And after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Neither, he replied. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. This is the word of the Lord. We're going to look at this under 3 headings. There is the cut, all right? There's also the commander and the claim. But to give you a little more texture, I have like kind of subtitles. There's the cut. That's knowing who you are. And then there's the commander, which is knowing who you serve. And then there's the claim, and that's knowing where you stand. Okay? So first, the cut. All right? This is knowing who you are. This is the moment. Does everybody, I hope you're picturing this in your mind's eye, all right? Israel has just made it across the Jordan, and now they've come into the land God has promised them, and there's one tiny obstacle between where they are and everything God has promised them, and it's the city of Jericho. Fortified, standing army. Militarily, this is not a feasible, this is a heavy lift. And then we're expecting, what are we expecting at this moment? This is it. This is the showdown. This is Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. If you're over 40, or if you're under 40, this is Captain America and Thanos. This is the moment. You're expecting the showdown. But that's exactly what you don't get. What you don't see is a battle plan. You don't see a list of military heroes like we would talk about the Alamo in our country. No. You don't see any of that. What you see is something very counterintuitive. Mass circumcision. That's what we're leading with. Now, as a military man, I have to tell you, this is very counterintuitive, okay? They have crossed the Jordan. The giant, unpassable barrier that had separated them from an adversary was no longer in play. They were now in proximity to an enemy who at any time could open their city gates and march out against them. And what do? No plan, no training montage. I imagine if this was cinematic, that's what you'd get. No. Get everybody together. We got some flint knives. Guys, you're going to love this plan. That's kind of the point. Where we would be expecting a military conquest, we get a worship service. And the reason is, and the narrator tells us exactly why. Because the generation that had been circumcised, the generation that came out of Egypt, you remember circumcision was a sign of God's covenant with his people, his sign of his pledge, his promise, and his love. The generation that came out of Egypt had been circumcised. The generation that was born in the wilderness had not. They didn't know who they were. And that is super important. Because I don't know if you're anything like me, when I come up against the Jerichos in my life, you know what I do? I do a quick inventory. What kind of tools do I have? What kind of resources do I have? What kind of people can I pull in? That's what I do. I come up with a plan. And what happens here is remarkably counterintuitive. And God knows something that the Israelites are kind of a little slow to figure out, but they're getting it right here. The key to their success, the key to the long-term outcomes here is not the plan, it's not the strategy, it's not the materials, it's not the logistical support. It is their identity. They have to, on the eve, on the precipice of the most daunting, pivotal moment in their national history, the biggest thing any of them had ever seen or lived through up to this point, at this moment, God is saying none of that is particularly important in relation to you knowing who you are. Now, this in right here in the middle of 5. There is a really interesting passage here. It's in verse 9. It says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you.' So the place has been called Gilgal to this day." Now, you don't get it in the English, but in Hebrew it's a play on words. Gilgal sounds like the Hebrew word for roll. And here, God is saying, we're going to call where they circumcised, where they recommitted themselves, where they had this collective kinesthetic, physical, visual reminder of who they were. God said this place is going to be called Gilgal because the reproach of the Egyptians has been rolled away. Now, what does that mean? I'll tell you what it can't mean. It can't mean that God is engendering Israel to forget all about Egypt. Just forget it. We're going to just put that out of your mind. That can't be it because immediately after this, they're going to celebrate the Passover. In fact, so much of Israel's national history and their identity as a people is so tied to remembering Egypt and all the way that God had provided for them. That cannot be what this is saying. So what is it saying? If the reproach of the Egyptians is rolled away. For hundreds of years, Israel had the boot of oppression on their neck. They were slaves. And God is telling them that they are no longer slaves, and they have to remember that. They have to understand that you are no longer victims, you're no longer oppressed, you're no longer slaves. And anyone who has ever worked with kids will understand immediately how important this is. I've been coaching for decades now, and I've had a lot of kids, hundreds, if not thousands of kids come through. And you can always pick the ones that come from scarcity and abuse. They wear it on their sleeves, don't they? You can just tell. And that is the point. Because we carry these things. They are our identity. Sometimes they go through the door before we do. And this is God's point to Israel. He's saying, you cannot possibly follow where I am leading unless the very first thing you need to do is remember who you are. You are not slaves. You are my children. I am your God, and I have gone before you. You are not victims. You are not oppressed. You are not slaves. You are free people, and you are my children, and I love you, and I will be with you. The very first thing, before the plans, before the logistics, before sharpening the spears and the swords, remember who you are. And then it's telling the very next thing they do is they celebrate the Passover. The ordained symbol of God's deliverance during the Exodus, that he provided the lamb. And the blood of this lamb is going to be painted over their doorposts, and God's wrath was going to pass over them. This visible, tasteable, tactile remember of God's grace and mercy and love, he says, you're going to do that because you need to remember who you are and who I am. Now, practically, how does this play out? I'll give you a personal example. When I was 12 years old, it's Mother's Day. I've shared this story a couple of times, but I have two women in my life to this day, my wife and my mom. The cat is a distant third. She thinks she's one. When I was 12 years old, I overheard a phone call that my mom had been diagnosed with lymphoma. And there I was a kid, and my parents had just gotten divorced. I was down to one parent, and I thought she was going to die. And I wasn't a Christian. I was a quasi-atheist, somewhat lost 12-year-old, okay? And that moment for me ushered me through a doorway into darkness I can't even explain. I faced Jericho without knowing who I was. And it almost destroyed me. Years later, now my mom survived. She's had cancer for 30 years. The running joke in my family is heaven doesn't want her and hell's afraid she'll take over. She's like the Energizer Bunny. Years later, I've shared this story too. My wife was very, very ill. I thought she was going to die. She was that sick, and there was about a 12 or 24-hour period where I really thought I might lose her. And this was in my 20s, and I had become a Christian. I was a young Christian, stumbling around in the dark, but I was a young Christian. Now, at the time, I thought I was in a hurricane. It was just, it was surreal. It seemed like everything slowed down, and just, it seemed like chaos. Looking back, I had what Paul describes as a peace that passes all understanding. I faced like one of the darkest, most challenging, most trying, most fear-provoking circumstances of my life, and I faced it knowing who I was with my king. And it was so different. It was so markedly different. This is precisely what Israel is. God is going through the greatest of pains to get them to understand before they embark on any of this, before they take their life in their hands, before they go up against the indomitable foe, before they follow him. They need to remember who they are. And so do you. And so do I. That's the cut. The second one is the commander. This is verses 13 through 15. This is my favorite part, by the way, just in case you didn't know that. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied. "But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. This is so textured. This is so layered. Couple of details I want to flesh out here. We have no idea how old Joshua is, but we know how old Caleb is, and Caleb is 85. Joshua and Caleb were contemporaries. They were the only two of the spies that returned who had the confidence to take on the land. They tried to encourage everybody else, and nobody listened. But we know Caleb's 85, so Joshua, he's a little long in the tooth. His brother's probably 80, 85 years old. And the Hebrew is really interesting. Joshua goes up to the walls of Jericho and he sees this mysterious figure. This is on the eve of the battle, and this fella is dressed for battle. Joshua asks a fair question. Are you for us or are you for them? I imagine that's what I would ask. But the Hebrew is really interesting. It says he went up and he got over there and he got in his face. This 85-year-old dude. Just like, imagine like, what the water? Hey, who are you with? The next thing that happens is really interesting. When he asks, are you for us or are you for them? What does the angel say? He says, neither. In the old King James Version, you know what it says? When he says, are you for us or are you for our enemies? No. No. He is for neither. Now, are we to think that this commander of the Lord's army is somehow morally neutral, that he really doesn't give a rip at the Canaanites or the Israelites? No. You can't think that, because that would be at variance to everything else in the story. What it does signify, however, is that you do not approach God and recruit him to your causes. You cannot come to God with an agenda. Now, the reality is, when most of us come to God, when most of us come looking, and we darken the doorway of a church, it's because something happened. And we come to God with needs. We come to God with real problems and concerns, and typically this is where a lot of people first begin to trust in the Lord. And so, this is not that, all right? You cannot come to God and say, these are my plans. I know how my life should go. And now, because it makes really sense logically to me, I'm going to invite you in to bless my plan. That just simply doesn't work. You cannot come to God with an agenda. I mean, that is the humility of the Lord, that he accepts people even on such terms when we come to him in desperation initially. But you can't come to God with an agenda. Now, what he's asking is the real question I think all of us are asking. Like, are you with me? Are you with me, God? Right? That's the same question all of us are asking. But there's at least something worth considering here. And I'm going to call this point, Poor Jesus Out in the Rain, okay? Go with me for a second. I taught New Testament theology to 11th graders for a number of years, and it was a very enriching experience for me. I don't know about them, but for me, it was eye-opening. They had a picture of Jesus, and it went something like this. They're 16, 17 years old, so it went something like this. And many of them grew up in Christian homes, and the furniture's in the room, but they're like, oh, yeah, Jesus, okay, like one day, someday, Jesus, I'll make time for you. Just pour Jesus out in the rain, right? Like one day, someday, Jesus, maybe when I'm older and I get married or have kids, I'll create space for you in my life. And it's just like, I'm picturing in my head, poor Jesus, like bedraggled out in the rain. You know, will you play with me? And that is not the picture that you see when you read the scriptures. I mean, let's consider this for a second. When Job encounters God, he encounters what? A tornado. When Jacob encounters God, he gets in a wrestling match. When Joshua encounters God, he encounters the commander of the Lord's army with a drawn sword. Do you know what a drawn sword is? A drawn sword in the scriptures is always emblematic of judgment. When Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, what does God put there as a barrier, as a symbol of his judgment that they'd abdicated their side of the deal? A flaming sword. And when you see Jesus show up in Revelation at the very end of days, terrifying. You do not approach this person and ask him to give you a little help or a little advice or to get on board with your plan. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, I would argue that a tepid response to Jesus is probably one of the most illogical things you can do. Enough on that. I will expand it just a little bit to say this. It's fairly frequent where you have a Christian celebrity, like somebody who's well known, but also, you know, pretty out of the closet about their faith. And what inevitably happens is these people come under fire, they come under scrutiny. You know, you'd be a basketball player, football player, MMA or something like that. And they'd be like, yeah, that's great. That's great for you. Can you just keep it to yourself? Can you keep it private? Do you have to keep talking about Jesus? I remember when I first became a Christian, my family was concerned. All of a sudden, I started giving time and money, and I being a very enthusiastic Christian. They thought I was in a cult. They were trying to do an intervention to get me back to like godless, hedonistic, secular humanism. The one thing that doesn't make any sense in relation to who this person is and what the reality of the scriptures is to have a tepid, lukewarm, like, oh, Jesus, yeah. I used to have a rabbit's foot. I know, it's barbaric. I'm like all the 20-year-olds are like, you carried a foot? It's a good luck thing. And I had it, I took it to school. I was that kind of student. I needed help on the tests, all right? So I would take it out and I would rub it. That's what you would do. You would rub a little rabbit's foot. There's a lot of people who treat Jesus like that. I'll invite you into my life if I can get a passing grade on the test. I'll invite you in my... And of course, we want Jesus to bless our marriages and to bless our families and to bless our work 100%. But that cannot, you cannot come to Jesus and have that be the exclusive reason. You have to look at him for who he is and what he's done. Remember who you are. Remember everything he's given to set you free. And this, by the way, this is my last point. The claim, you've got to know where you stand. The question that we're tempted to ask about this divine warrior that we see here in Joshua 5 is, who is he? And that's a fair question. And there are some context clues here I want to show you. The first one is that Joshua, what's his immediate response? Falls flat on his face. He worships this individual. Now, why is that important? We're tempted to think, oh, this is the commander of the Lord's army. This is an angel. However, if you go to the very end of Revelation chapter 21, Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. It was given to Jesus by God. Jesus gives it to an angel. The angel gives it to John. John's interacting with this angel. At some point, John is tempted, as I'm sure I would be, to worship this angel. And he gets down and he worships him. And the angel does what? He corrects him and says, no, get up, with a little bit of urgency. Get up. I'm a created being like you. Angels do not receive worship. There's another clue where he says, take off your sandals, for the ground you're standing on is holy. That should sound familiar. That is the exact thing God said to Moses. And the name that Joshua ascribes to this individual is the Lord. Now, in your Bible, the Lord could mean any number of things in Hebrew, but this is the covenantal name of God, the holy name of God that to this day, faithful Jews will not even utter. Christians for thousands of years have held that this is not an ordinary angel. This is actually the Lord. And when the Lord shows up in flesh and bone, Christians understand that to be the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. This is Jesus. The better question isn't who is this person? It is how does Joshua survive the encounter? Because look, I want to show you a couple of places. In Judges 13, chapter 22, Samuel's parents, they actually come into contact with God. And their immediate response is what? We are doomed to die. We have seen God. Right? Exodus 33. This is verse 20. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. The better question is, how on earth does Joshua survive this encounter? Well, what's really interesting to me is this particular commander. This is the incarnate Lord Jesus. He's the commander of the Lord's army. You can trace him all the way through scriptures. And when you encounter him, look, Job encounters him, and it's a tornado. Jacob encounters him, and it's a wrestling match. Here, Joshua encounters him, and it is the most intimidating warrior you've ever seen. He's holding the sword of judgment. And this is Jesus Christ. And it should make you quake in your boots a little bit. And the reason Joshua can survive this encounter is because that sword actually fell on Jesus himself. In Isaiah 53, years later, the prophet would write, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgression, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each has turned to our own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. The reason Joshua was able to approach Jesus is because the punishment landed on Jesus. The sword landed on Jesus. The reason Joshua could come before God is the same reason any of us can. And it is not based on our merit, our righteousness, our record. Heavens no, it is based on the merit of this divine warrior, the real Passover lamb. Now, years later, this warrior would be divested of his sword and his armor. And he would allow himself to be stripped naked and punched in the face and nailed to a cross. And on that cross, he would be surrounded by what the Bible tells us are two thieves. And those two thieves are asking the same question that Joshua asked. And it's the same question we all ask. Are you with me or against me? The first thief says, if you are who you say you are, you can get me down off of this cross. Are you with me? And the second thief says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he asks a better question. Am I yours? And to that thief, Jesus says, this day, you will be with me in paradise. That's the point. We come to God with one of two questions. Are you with me or am I with you? Am I with you is the appropriate one. He wants you. You can't come to him with an agenda. You can't say, join my team, join my causes. It just doesn't work like that. But he loves you and he gave everything to know you. Jesus did not have to go to the cross. He says, I could have called down legions of angels, but he did it because he loves you, so that you could know who you are. This concludes the teaching of God's word.